As we come to the final hour of this conference, may I now invite Professor Gina Hens-Piazza, professor at the Jesuit School of Theology, Santa Clara University, Berkeley, California, and Professor Paul Béré, coordinator of the Nexus, to provide a synthesis of the conference and to offer their concluding remarks. Welcome, Professor Gina and Father Paul.
Thank you. Could you open it? Just put some in for me. Well, good afternoon. That you are all still sitting here, I'm not sure whether you should be complimented or counseled, but we are grateful. This is titled in the program Concluding Remarks. I think it should just be remarks, because in many ways this conference feels not like a conclusion, but a great opening, a beginning. And so I have remarks from the conference, but really intended as points of departure for what will follow from this conference. Some are my own thoughts and critiques, some are my own dreaming about what can become of this time together. And so I appreciate that you're willing to stay with us during this final short series of concluding remarks. Ron Witherup really warmed up the crowd the other day, I think, and set the stage for exactly what is the goal of biblical exegesis, and I think reiterated well the familiar distinction between exegesis and eisegesis. However, as I listened, I couldn't help wonder about that distinction, especially today. It reminded me of a book I read some years ago by the great literary critic Stanley Fish. The title of the book is There a Text in This Class? Fish was arguing in that now familiar essay that while a class of 20 or so students will all read the same assigned textbook, each will read and hear a different text because of the reader's role in the reception of the text. Thus, a text is composed, so to speak, both at the time of composition and in the experience of reception. And the biblical text, first and foremost, like any text, is therefore also a product of both composition and reception. Thus, it occurs to me that every exegesis is on some level also an eisegesis by mere virtue of the situatedness of the individual doing the reader, their culture, and the reception that goes on during that exegetical inquiry. As I continued to listen, I was struck by the numbers of essays that situated and cited their comments in conjunction with this little well-worn book of mine, and many of you have a copy from the Pontifical Biblical Commission's document of 1993, The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church. And while that document made space for newer approaches that I heard the other day called complementary approaches, I assume complementary to historical criticism, these complementary approaches that focused upon the world of the text, different literary approaches, or the world in front of the text that we've heard about today, still this document assigned prolonged attention and priority to historical critical studies as the privileged exegetical method for interpretation. In several of the papers, which enlisted historical and social science studies from the world behind the text, I heard a new caution about certitude regarding the historical grounding against which biblical texts are situated and interpreted. Dominic Markle's paper, for example, offered, I think, offered a nuanced assessment of historical criticism, suggesting we conduct our critical work with a more qualified confidence in what historical claims can be made in conjunction with the biblical texts. Even the realm of one of the most foundational kinds of historical criticisms or inquiry, namely text criticism, is itself undergoing a major revision in claims that it makes these days. I was paging through the most recent revision of Emmanuel Tove's volume of text criticism that's on the table in the foyer, and was struck with the contrast in his definition of text criticism compared to his earlier editions. And you see this up on the screen. In his second edition, Tove defined text criticism as, and I quote him, dealing with the origin and nature of all the forms of the biblical text, involving a discussion of its putative original forms and an analysis of the various representatives of the changing biblical text. However, in the most recent edition that you have out in the foyer there on the table, text criticism is defined by Tove as dealing with the nature and origin of all the witnesses of the biblical texts, with an analysis that attempts to discover the original form of details in a composition or even large stretches of text, although what exactly constitutes an original text is subject to much debate. Two reasons likely explain this shift. First, according to my colleague James Natty, the publication of Dead Sea Scrolls since the 1990s highlight the difficulty of dealing with, quote, the putative forms of the text, to use the language of the earlier handbook. And the second reason may well have to do with the retreat among biblical scholars, and we heard it at this conference in general, as to what constitutes history, a move away from assertions of a certainty with respect to the purported past due to broader methodological trends in scholarship, away from narrowly conceived historical questions. Further, in the past, the biblical world has been treated as a stable background against which the unstable, ambiguous text that we think about as the biblical text itself is positioned or grounded upon for interpretation. However, the recognition that history itself is textualized, that we used, and is actually therefore one-dimensional, is not unlike the biblical text itself, which makes for a less sure and less stable anchor for this past approach to interpretation. I think another somewhat destabilizing factor that qualifies historical critical studies, which has been so central to our work, is the realization that most historical reconstructions of the biblical world have been crafted from above, and these reconstructions inform the work of biblical interpretation. But increasing number of scholars here present, in fact, from, for example, the Southern Hemisphere, have assumed their rightful place in biblical studies, and they ask questions of the biblical texts that mandate reconstructions of history from below, not solely from what the biblical text, archaeology, and epigraphic evidence tell, but also from what they do not tell, from what stories and information about certain groups or peoples or whole communities are left out. I give, for example, the account of Josiah's religious reform. Josiah's religious reform has been studied from above by looking at other ancient Near Eastern societies, the temples, the roles they played in political shifts, in religious allegiances, and it raises the question within history, in conjunction with that text, what motivated Josiah's reform? Was it political concerns or was it religious concerns? In addition, of course, to the finding of the law book. But it took a student in my class from the Altiplano in Bolivia to hear and see in that text the history that had been obscured, but that was there implied and had never been constructed about the economics of the peasant world, to ask cautiously in class, "Professor, what about all the peasants that lost their jobs when that religious reform took place? The women who wove clothes for Asherah, or perhaps the people who sold vegetables and fruits in the marketplace for the sacrifices that worshiped the sun and the moon and the stars when those altars were taken down? What happened to those peasants who lost their jobs?" And that's what I mean about the need to construct history also from below. So, in addition to some of the concerns we have now with the way history and historical criticism has been done, we also heard yesterday papers that began with scriptural exegetes who took the risky turn toward theology, and across these presentations skillfully, I think, disclosed the complex and still to be clarified relationship between these disciplines. The questions we are left with is biblical theology, a theology of the Bible, or a theology in accordance with the Bible, or a study of the theology of the theologies of the Bible, or is it the foundation for a systematic theology? And what exactly are those relationships? I think that was a wonderful opening of what is yet to be explored in the work that is before us. Further, I would mention the presentations on the Bible and spirituality and the Bible and ethics that boldly abandoned the strictly exegetical course that we had been pursuing here and revealed further the potential of sacred texts to yield meaning apart from formal exegesis. The series of papers on philosophical hermeneutics and contextual interpretation today, I think, raised very important and serious challenges for moving forward in the globalization of biblical studies. And here by globalization, I mean, I think what Professor Gerard was very clear about. We're not looking for a monolithic approach to biblical studies. We're talking about, can there be a way to include the great variety of approaches to biblical studies in some kind of a inclusive hermeneutic? The Pontifical Biblical Commission's document under the particular heading, Contextual Approaches, recognized, and here I quote it, that these exegetes from around the world bring to their work points of view that are new and responsive to contemporary currents of thought which have not up until now been taken sufficiently into consideration, end of quote. In this regard, I note the processes that leads to biblical interpretation in Uriel Salas's presentation today, Jean-Claude's presentation, Rashia Sujitharaja's presentation, which suggests a kind of interpretive procedure taking place in these contexts quite different from what American and European exegetes have been trained to do. The philosophy of interpretation, or the hermeneutical foundation that we heard about for much of what we are speaking about at this conference has been grounded utterly in Western philosophy. The persuasive recognition of presuppositions and pre-understandings in interpretation are largely developed out of this influence by such representative figures that we heard about, Immanuel Kant and Martin Heidegger and Hans Gregor Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur, etc. But the rise of a global biblical studies during the past 2 to 3 decades warrants or suggests the need to acknowledge other ways of proceeding in biblical interpretation, ways that take seriously the philosophical foundations of the non-Western cultures, especially of Asia and Africa and Latin America. This would mean many of us in Europe and America doing biblical studies have much to learn from our colleagues from these parts of the world. The resulting yield from contextual studies of the Bible is a great plurality of interpretation, a plurality with a potential, I think, to build a truly inclusive biblical hermeneutic, if we could imagine such a thing. However, the resulting plurality and diversity prompts, I think, 2 further concerns. First, what makes for legitimate biblical interpretation within a global church? With such a vast array of culturally contextual interpretations, are all and any interpretations admissible? Is there a criteria or set of boundaries within which interpretation of the scriptures are deemed legitimate, or some rejected as too idiosyncratic? These are some of the questions I'm left with in listening to my colleagues here this week. In addition, finally, as the culturally contextualized world of in front of the text of different faith communities become part of the dialogue in the interpretive enterprise, or in what we might call the Gadamarian dialogue of fusion of horizons, perhaps not only must the text be exegeted or interrogated or questioned, but so also might also the cultural context of the community be exegeted, be questioned and interrogated. Culture itself, any culture, is imperfect. Culture is laden with good values, but it also is marred by less than virtue, less than good values. And also that is true of the exegete themselves. I think all of us who do our work, our critical work, must enter into a real self-examine when we come to the text as to what are our presuppositions, our predispositions, even perhaps our biases, our prejudices, as we come to a text, especially one that we might be familiar with. Unless any of us believe that we can do biblical interpretation as some kind of tabula rasa without any predispositions, I would say that in itself is already a predisposition. Finally, these concerns, the plurality of an interpretation resulting from a truly inclusive biblical interpretation, is actually a great wealth. A truly inclusive biblical hermeneutic will expand not only our understanding of scriptures, but also our understanding of each other. Dare I suggest that the interpretation of the Bible has the potential to create an intrinsic unity, a unity not grounded in or defined by sameness, but a unity summoned by dialogue. And here I'm thinking of dialogue, or the dialogia as defined in philosophy, where exchange between 2 parties results in an insight in excess of either party and what they've brought to the table. An insight that illuminates the encounter between the two. Something new is disclosed. Thus, this unity will not be defined, as I said, by sameness, but by a dialogue about our differences and the different way we hear and understand the Word of God. yet a dialogue that at the same time discloses these different ways of understanding our scriptures that still proves to be life-giving for all of us in our different and varied context. Finally, my last word. It's about Nexus. Anyone who knows me knows I like words, and I like to look up the history of words. I suppose it's somewhat of what young people would call a very geeky activity. And so I am a word geek, I guess. But when I looked up the history of the word nexus, I discovered its use dates back to the 16th century. And in its early implementation, it was understood not so much to specify a center point or a link or a connection, but it was used to moderate a series of connections. And I think that may let us off the hook during this conference if we came hoping to discover a nexus, a link. Because I think what really has richly resulted is an abundant link or network of connections among the papers we've heard, among the connections that we have made, that I think pave the way forward as this being not a conclusion, but as a beginning. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to keep you longer than that. I won't go through all the slides, but I think Gina has covered everything. So my questions are up there. What have I heard? What issues are still on my mind? What would I like to bring back on the table of the discussions? And a postscriptum. But I want to repeat what struck me from Joseph Ratzinger's comment in 2003. The magisterium no longer imposes norms on the exegetes from above, but they themselves are the ones who determine the criteria that indicate the way for a fitting interpretation of this special book. So that's important. So Gina said that this is the beginning. It's up to us to do our homework. Now, I have a few, I don't know if it's readable, but I have a few points. I won't read them. To answer my first question, what have I heard? So up there you can see a few points, what I heard and what struck me. And then what issues are still on my mind. You can see pneumatology, meaning as informative and transformative, reading and rereading, biblical morality as indicative and not imperative, etc. World of, the abused. It's a world beyond regions, etc., etc. What would I like to bring back to the table of the discussion? Dialogical approach. We need to dialogue, but we need a common language. Inspiration, we take granted that we know what it is, but actually we don't. Sacred page, the tension, is it the word of God? Is it the word of human beings? So these are tensions. And then the political dimension of our traditional exegesis, Bible and empire, the subversive character of the Bible, writing as resistance and reading as resistance to oppressive power, etc. I want to share my own postscriptum dialogue. What I really want to reflect on is we need to dialogue. One aspect of our dialogue for me is orality, the capacity to listen to what others have to say. And the second is translation, in the sense of recur, reformulate in the language of one's own field, discipline or method. The capacity to reformulate means to translate what the other is saying. And then to contribute, bring to the conversation my proper voice or my perspective from my discipline or method. Now, I have learned from Archic, our friends are here, Professor Violence, receptive ecumenism. And I would like to draw from that and look at the 2 points there. I learned from Archic, the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, that to succeed in dialoguing, what we need is to start not from our strength, but from our weakness. So, what is my weakness, my limit? The limit of the method I'm using, the limit of the discipline I'm in, the limit of my culture, etc. And then go to the other and ask, what is her strength? So what can I learn from another discipline? What can I learn from the other, another culture, etc.? So, and I was happy to see that a quotation of Recur, which I wrote at the end, exegetes must be aware of the weak points of their strong points. That would be my last word. And I'm really grateful to Gina because you covered everything. I came in with my footnotes. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I just have a final word, and that is, I think we all owe a profound sense of gratitude to Professor Paul Béré, but also to the committee members and all the folks, the students that have been here organizing the table out front and running around with microphones. And there's so many people behind the scenes that have been taking care of us, bringing us water, running the computers. This is an immense undertaking, and I just would like us to take a moment to really thank them. And I would like to stand up and thank you. So thank you very much.
Now I don't know what to do because I had prepared a word to say thank you.
We're thanking you.
So, but allow me to say a few things. I would like to thank all of you. This is the end of our conference, and on behalf of our team, so I'd like really to express a word of gratitude to all those who came from abroad, our speakers, and those from our own institutions. Your willingness to set aside your own duties to join us and discuss our common concerns is greatly appreciated. I would like also to extend a special thanks to Professor Gina Hens-Piazza for the dedication. I mean, she dedicated time and effort in listening to all the papers and assisting us in providing feedback to all the sessions. So thank you, Professor Gina. So I'd like to thank our leaders, the rector of the Pontifical Biblical Institute and the rector of the Pontifical Gregorian University, for their unwavering support We also extend our thanks to our deans, Professor Henry Patarumatatil and Professor Craig Morrison. They were very supportive right from the beginning. And we also extend our thanks to our Secretary General, yes, Dr. Carlo Valentino. You know him. So, to all the colleagues of our institutions, both the PBI and PGU, we say thank you. They came right from the beginning along with the teams, and here we are. I would like to extend our appreciation to the members of the organizing team with whom you interacted. Allow me to mention Professoressa Paola Mollo, from the Ancient Near Eastern Faculty of the Biblicum, Mrs. Giuseppina Costantini, the Secretary of the Biblicum's Rector, Mrs. Nieves Michelini, Mrs. Luisa, and our student volunteers who welcomed us in this aula, and Father Naveen Ribello, our MC, who marvelously guided us through all the sessions, and many others who worked behind the scenes, as you said, Professor Hens-Piazza, and to ensure that the website and online connections ran smoothly. So thank you so much. Finally, we extend our gratitude to our generous benefactors. You can see some of them there, but the Gregorian Foundation, the Jesuit Conference of the US and Canada, Missio, and others who wish to remain anonymous. So may the Lord bless them and bless their generosity. So for those of you who will be traveling, we wish you a safe journey, and thank you again for your participation and contribution to this conference. May the Lord bless you all. Thank you.